Hello, I'm Caleb with Bitterroot Gunleather, and I'm going to show how I template and design a holster. This is a brand new mold that I just got in from Rings Blue Guns, and it is for a Beretta Custom 92FC that will also have a slide-mounted optic and a co-witness front sight. So I looked at the pictures. This is very necessary to have an idea of where your optic is going to be on your holster, because naturally you can't design a holster to go into a holster to have a gun go into it with an optic there. If you're going to cut a mouth to go all the way up there, your optic's going to stop the gun. So you need to be able to imagine, if you will, this optic taking up the space on this. It's also much wider than this, so you have to imagine like a big Lego block right here getting in the way of leather. So you have to design around that. First thing that I do is I chop off the front sight. And the reason that I do that is so that I can put a dowel on, and the dowel will lay flat on the slide and create a channel for the holster, for the front sight to travel through the holster without snagging on leather. So this is also important in the design of my holster. I'm going to mark off about 3/16 of an inch. And that right there is where the front of the optic plate is on this specific custom gun. You'll have to also keep in mind that optics like the Trijicon SRO and RMR HD have this snout on the lens that goes further forward, and that's going to mean that you have to cut lower than that. So I don't bother with those optics. I don't build my gun holsters around them. They take off too much meat from the holster, and they're unable to do their job in terms of retention. So I stay away from those entirely. That's my choice. All right, let's see, where are we at? So I have my imaginary optic placement. I have my sight channel, and I'm going to tape it on. A lot of people use painter's tape. I use electrical tape because it lays flat, it doesn't wrinkle, I stretch it, and it's strong, and yeah, there's a few reasons. All right, make sure that we're centered. All right, so the most important aspect of this that I see people kind of they don't judge it correctly is that the width of the slide and the frame are very often, almost entirely always, larger than the width of the trigger guard. Now, you'll see why this is important later, but keep that in mind. Not every trigger guard is wide. And also, there are guns that don't look really big, but they're square, like Glocks. A Glock isn't much bigger than this, but because the profile is a square, they take up a lot more surface area, and you have to make a wider stitch line for those. 1911s and CZs are a little different in that regard. All right, so I'm going to place my mold directly, and I'm going to use this line in this paper, this folder, to gauge that I'm centered. And I'm going to use about the rear sight area, and I'm going to be about 1/4 of an inch away from the tip of the holster, and that's going to allow me to do a couple of things in the future. But I'm going to trace around the slide of the gun. And this is going to help me in future as well. You can just start from here, but I like making sure that I have this reference of the slide width. So now I'm laying down and I'm keeping the top of this sight channel here parallel with the center of the sheet, and that's going to make sure that I have a straight line for my stitching in the future. This is where I'm going to have to gauge how wide the slide is and how tall the front sight is. Because the optic on a Beretta has to be put up high, a front sight has to be taller in order to co-witness it all with the dot. So that's taken into consideration. I'm tracing the border of this gun, and I'm keeping it as I'm keeping the ink, the pen, as close to the gun as possible without going underneath. I want to be able to look straight up and down the profile of this holster mold and see the ink as if it's straight up. I don't want to have to turn my head this way in order to see it, because that's going to affect my stitch line. I'm going to turn this over, and keep in note, this is about 3/8 of an inch away from the center line. The top of this is about 3/8 of an inch from the center line here. And I'm going to turn it over, make sure that it's flat on there again. And I'm going to get about 3/16 of an inch, the same distance, and being completely parallel with that line. I'm going to see here that this distance is the same as this distance, and then here that this distance to the edge of the paper is also the same. Trace this mold, follow the same rules, and it's especially important from here to here. The grip, not so much. It's going to help you with the grip purchase and the space that you need. So make sure that that's accurate, but it doesn't have to be precise. Now, while your gun mold is over on this side, keep in mind your magazine release. If you design a holster to cover the magazine release, pressure from your body against your holster can push in on this, and your magazine will pop out when you least desire that. So here's how I keep my magazine release, how I provide space for my magazine release. I put my pen over my mag release. I keep my hand perfectly, absolutely still. I move my gun away, and I can see where the center of the mag release is. I go down, I mark it, and then I trace a little bit larger than the profile of the mag release. This is going to give me a little bit of wiggle room in case I was off by 1/16 of an inch or so. All right, that was all done in pen and ink. Now I'm switching to pencil. And actually, while I'm here, I need to do something important. I need to mark for my optic. I get my gun lined back up exactly where it was. I find the mark that I put on my holster mold, and I mark it for an optic. This is not where you want the top of your cut to be. You want the top of your mouth cut to be lower than this, because by the time you're done designing your gun holster, your gun is going to sink deeper into the leather. So you're actually going to be designing your holster closer to here. And also, you can't just, sorry about that. You can't just continue your leather straight up like this, because there is meat here that has to be taken up, and the slide is not the same width as the plate of your optic. So you actually need to extend this over imagining that this all can't be, none of this space can be taken up with leather. All right, so let's get to the next spot of our design. We have our trace done, we have our optic considered, we have our magazine release considered, and we look like we're ready to go here. I have a River Access AIWB, and for that I will need this to gauge. So this is going to be my belt line. The most important placement consideration when placing your clip is balance. If your belt clip is too high, your gun is going to be very deep into your holster. And this is all the space that you're going to have between your belt and your hand to grab, or belt and your grip to grab with your hand. Your hand's not going to be able to fit in that area. So we need to bring it down. If it's too low, like this is all going to be above your belt. And this is going to be everything that's inside of your pants. And what's going to happen here is eventually you're going to lean forward and your gun is going to want to roll over your belt. So you need to have proper balance. First consideration is purchase, the area that your fingers will need to get into to get a grip on your gun. That's going to be about there. Now you consider how much gun is inside of the pants. And that is more inside than outside. I think this is a good height to consider for our clip. Now we have to remember that this clip is held in by hardware, and I use T-nuts for this. T-nuts have a wide base of about 1/2 inch. So we put our T-nut in here, and we can see that if we put it here, this is where our T-nut goes, extends to. There isn't any material here because our T-nut will be here. We need to be able to stitch around our T-nut. I don't know if this is making sense to everybody, but what we're seeing here is this is going to be the mouth of the holster, and it's going to go up here, and I'm going to need to be able to stitch all of this. That's not going to work if I have a T-nut there. So now I have to make a adjustment. I'm going to put this clip further towards the trigger guard. Now, if I go too far over the trigger guard, then my clip is going to be over the trigger area, and this piece here is going to bend down, and it's not going to have any material to grab onto. Yes, you'll be able to put your belt on it, and your belt will grab on, but there won't be any pressure holding it to your, pinching your belt to your holster. And what's going to happen there is you're going to draw, and your holster is going to tilt because your gun is just depending on this hook. There's no actual like contact there. So you're going to end up with a problem. So essentially, you can't bring this clip over the trigger guard. It has to be over the frame, at least partially. So here we go. We know where the frame continues. You see that it's a straight line, and your frame continues that way. So that's the furthest that you can have this little lip on the belt clip. All right, so now I've moved it over, and I can see that I have a lot more room. I have about 1/2 inch more space to put this T-nut. Because if it's there, my T-nut's there, I have another T-nut about there, and I can now design so that a stitch line is around this T-nut, and then the edge of the leather after I've cut it and everything is actually going to be there. Now this is why optics need to be considered in design. I'm going to bring this mouth of the holster down past this optic plate, and I also have to contour the edges to imagine so that the plate, let me grab a hole. All right, so you can see the plate on this, and luckily I have my TLR7 sub right here. Put it on. Okay, so we have an optic plate right here. We know where the edge of the optic plate is going to be, and we're putting it on. This optic plate is cleared all the way to there, and this material on the side, the optic plate expands out wider than the slide. So if the optic plate is there, it's going to hit the walls of the holster on the corner. You can't just like shove it through. This leather's actually pretty hard and difficult to move once it's been cured. So you need to imagine that width of the optic plate when designing the holster. All right, moving on. I am following the profile of the gun and the slide, and the difference between this and the gun that I'm building for is the gun that I'm building for doesn't have a decocker up here. It has a safety right here. The safety is also relatively smooth in nature. It doesn't paddle off like a 2011. So I'm not really worried about that thing grabbing onto clothes. I'm not worried about it poking you in the side. However, I am going to cover it with a small portion of the leather, and I have to use my imagination and use the picture that I looked at as a reference. But the trigger or the safety extends to about here on this gun, and I'm going to cover it by about 1/4 of an inch just to make sure that it stays in place when you're holstering and reholstering your gun, because you know that's important. All right, so about there's the edge of the safety. I'm gonna put the leather. I'm gonna cut the leather to go about that high. Consider now the shape here. Your safety is gonna hit about there if you're not molding it to your safety. So you need to make sure that it's not going to hit and then go down when you holster your gun. You want it to hit and be forced up if it's going to hit. Otherwise, you're going to be putting an unsafe gun in your pants. So imagine that. This is all very advanced thinking, but you don't get to that level of thinking without making a mistake along the way. And I'm just trying to make it sure that people don't make that mistake. Nobody told me about that until I did it, and then I had to remake a holster, and it takes a lot of time out of my day, and that's something that I'm trying to cut out of your experience with my experience. All right, so I was just doodling. Here's going to be my there. It's going to be my belt clip, because that's on. Imagine the belt stops there. Belt's going to start here. Our balance is good. Right here is going to be where my mounting hardware goes, and I'm going to design my stitch line. I'm not necessarily designing the edge of the leather right now. The more important thing to consider at this point is the stitch line, and then the leather design goes around it. All right, so we've gotten the mouth cut done. Now's the stitch line. Stitch line, once again, you remember this is much smaller than this. So the stitch line needs to be closer to the gun here than here. You can see this, and this is going to be learned by experience. There's no math for this, and yes, I've seen holster makers use math for it, but the thickness of your leather has to be considered, the temper of your leather has to be considered, the flexibility, your ability to mold well, your hand strength. These are all things that need to be considered. Your tools, all of that adds up to mean where your stitch line is going to be. There's no mathematical way for me to tell you this is exactly where your stitch line is going to be every time. You have to know the leather that you're using. You have to know your capabilities. You have to know the gun that you're using. There's a lot that goes into this. I've been doing this for 8 or 9 years, and I've come up with a system that works for me that I'm going to teach you, but it isn't going to work for you. You're going to have to figure out your own system to make this work. So around the trigger guard, that's about the space that I need because of the width on the trigger guard. There's a point on the trigger guard, and that's going to be respected. Same width here as here, but now we're at this frame here. This frame here is 3/4 of an inch wide, maybe, maybe a little bit more. So I'm going to be further away in that distance from the slide on the stitch line. Now here, this is a very narrow portion in relative to the slide. So I'm going to need to be closer here, or I can just not care and make this go, at an angle, and that's all fine and good. I just hold myself to a different standard. All right. 90 degree turns. This right here on this gun is not a 90 degree. It doesn't come to a point. It goes to, it smooths out. It rounds off a little bit. If it did come to a point, I still wouldn't take all that leather to a 90 degree turn. And what you'll learn is when you put a 90 degree in here, all of this area here is pinched off from that stitch holding it together. And you're not going to be able to push this holster into here because all of this material is going to compete with this one little dot. So smooth it off or round it off, and don't ever stitch in a 90 degree there. All right. So now we have our stitch line. Make sure that you like the distance from here to here to here to here. Consider this is a big gap. We're not thinking about the trigger guard here. We're thinking about this big space right here that's taken up, that we're going to have to fill all of this in right here. It's not your trigger guard that's going to take that up. It's this beefy frame. That's also a square, I might add, like an absolute sharp corner square. So that's a lot of material that's going to be taken up in there. All right, so now I have the frame, the rail ending. Yeah, I do that. And I'm going to contour it naturally down and stop about there. I double up my stitch lines on my outside the waistband holsters. I think that's kind of a standard in the industry. I trace it down gently, and if I want to later, I can draw it harder to get a more defined line, but I'm not going to. All right, so something to consider with your stitch line and your trigger guard. If I carried the stitch line all the way up to my trigger guard and brought it out here and it mated there, your trigger guard is going to stop there. It's not going to seat in all the way. All of this material right here is going to be space that's taken up by the depth of the gun. So while it looks like this here on paper, by the time you wrap it in leather and squeeze it in and mold it, it's actually going to be more like this. And what you need to look at this point is this rail portion. This rail portion up here, I imagined it being right here, but by the time the gun is sunk in a little bit, my rail is now hitting right there. So I need to drop this down a little bit, or else my rail is going to stop the holster or the gun from going into the holster. And this is where you need to consider your abilities to stitch properly if you need to just corner it off there, or even take it around here and leave this dead space. But like I said, standards, everybody's got different standards. I'm going to do one stitch line in and then one stitch line down. And that's going to be how I design my holster. All right, next we need to look at making sure that your trigger is covered, because now that we've got our stitch line done, the only thing that's and the mouth done, the only thing that's left is the external profile of the holster. This inside the waistband holster. Oh, this is an IWB, so I'm not double stitching here. This line is obsolete. Now you know what to do for an OWB if you double stitch though. All right, so right here is where this is going to be. I contour this down so that I can flare out my leather, and that helps give my gun a little bit of wiggle room to go straight in. And it's also going to prevent my holster from expanding, closing off this area here that I need to stay open for a front sight. If this was straight up here, I would try to draw, this would flare out and this would go down and my front sight would hit it every time. So I've seen a lot of people do this and then go to there. I don't do that. I move it out and I go down like that. All right, so the rest of this stitch line is obsolete, this doubled area here. All right, so now we're doing the grip. We want natural curves on our leather or straight. We don't want jagged curves. This is going to create a fold eventually if it's a point, if it comes to a point. So go smooth, natural turns. When you get to the edge here, this is going to be the edge of this area here. If you make this sharp, your finger will poke it and it will be uncomfortable. Round it off. Consider the distance from your stitch line to the edge of your holster. All right, this is something that I learned pretty recently. If I follow this down to here and then hook in like this right here digs into your groin area, and this is very noticeable. You don't want that. You want a smoothed out leather panel there. All right, trace this down to there, smooth it off. All right, so now we need to test placement for our mod wing. So I can't put this up here. There's a stitch line here, and the stitch line is going to dictate that I can't put a piece of hardware there. Has to be about 1/8 of an inch or further from the stitch line, because this is going to create a weak point in the leather. You want to stay away from those when imagining this. So we have our clip right here, our belt right here, and our belt needs to press on the wing. You can see that the optimal placement is right here. But what's in the way is our stitch line. It's actually going to be closer to there. We're not punching these holes right now, obviously. This is just kind of a reference for us. If it was a larger trigger guard, like on some HKs that extend much further down, this would be down here. And the problem is going to be that your belt is not going to be pushing on this anymore. So then you'll need to bring down your belt clip. And then you need to consider the height of your gun and the balance. And this doesn't work for all guns, you know. But this is what we're doing. We're keeping it up here. This is going to go here. Bottom of the belt is going to be on there. That is plenty of meat to grab onto. And then I just need to remember that when I punch out this holster mold, or when I punch out this clip thing right here, I need to make sure that I don't go high. If anything, I need to go low by a 1/16 of an inch. But all right, so we have our T-nut spaced here, our T-nut spaced here, and I need to make sure that I don't have a stitch line on the T-nut. Go up, and I like to put an angle, a downward angle on my holster mouth, just to make sure that all of this area of the trigger guard is covered. I don't want this to be exposed. But up here, I have the mag release. All of this area here is going to be space behind the trigger, and I need to cover that space. All right, so now I have this side of the holster done, the stitch line done. I have this space considered for the T-nuts. I have the spots where I'm going to punch holes. And I have now to consider my mouth reinforcement. This is going to be a River Access, so I need to consider that this belt clip has to extend. These little prongs have to go past the mouth. If they're on the mouth, then this belt clip is going to ride like this, and it's going to cause problems. With leather, it's different than Kydex. There's kind of a lip on Kydex that lifts the leather up like that, or that lifts the material up so that this lays flat. I do that with my whole mouth reinforcement. Once again, you want natural curves, natural lines, and you don't want a 90-degree here, because that's going to mean that this piece here is going to create a sharp point. You don't want sharp points on leather. They are uncomfortable and create weaknesses. All right, so here is my stitch line. I'm going to create this holster to have this style, and I do this with low cut mouths. If I just bring this across like here, the only material creating a mouth reinforcement is going to be 1 inch long. That's not a lot of material to keep this holster from collapsing. So I'm going to extend my mouth reinforcement lower. I'm going to put some natural curves into here. And I'm going to go back up and kind of mirror this. That's an option. Sometimes people will go all the way over here and do that, and I got no problem with that. In fact, I might do that today just to keep this from turning into a pressure point. I want that covered. These are all weird considerations that somebody like me puts into a holster design, but it's what works for me, and I hope somebody gets something out of this. All right, so next is the mouth reinforcement angle on the back piece, where the single layer of leather is going to meet with the mouth reinforcement is on this corner here. I do not do a 90-degree or, an equilateral thing right here. I continue this to have kind of this natural curve right there. I go through a lot of erasers, not a lot of lead. All right, so if I bring this down here and go like this, all this stuff right here is going to, it's going to be difficult to put my gun in. Right here, remember, we have a stitch line. So all this material right here, we don't want to be doubled up. I like to consider the shape of my gun when deciding these little nuances. Now I'm going to look it all over. This is pardon me. This is an area that we want to be reinforced with a double layer of leather so that it doesn't create a hazard with the trigger area. And it also, we want to leave this area singled so that we don't want to cover it with 2 layers because we want to be able to mold into this trigger guard, and it's difficult to mold into 2 layers of leather. So those things considered, you can either draw or imagine your stitch line. You can't bring this past here. Leave room for these prong tips on your belt clip. All right, so this is where I'm going to double check to make sure that I have my T-nut spacing considered. I can't stitch onto my T-nut. I need to stitch around it. I have plenty of room there. If it was up here, obviously my stitch line would be hitting the edge of my T-nut and I'd be blasting a needle and possibly blinding myself. Don't do that. So if anything, here's the highest point that your belt mounting holes can go. If anything, bring them down a little bit, but make sure that they're brought down equally. And don't bring them down too far because then you're gonna fudge with the balance of your holster mold. All right, so I don't need to draw this out because when I cut this, it's going to cut the same on both sides. And this is why it's important to line up your mold the same distance here to here as here to here. So this is something I learned. This point right here, if I leave this at a 90 degree, it's going to create a sharp point right here with the material that's going to stab into your pants or your leg and be uncomfortable. So I round that off at this point. If you forget to do it at this point, you can do it later, but I round it off. Now I'm cutting out my holster. I'm being careful not to go over the line. If anything, leave space so that, because you can always take away material, you can't add it. So here we can see that I'm going to be able to grab my gun around the grip and have area for my fingers, and it's not going to hit a sharp point right there. So now we've hit the edge of the gun mold, and we'll flip it over. You can see that I've nailed this. I'm right at the edge of the gun mold. But it's different. This goes up in a swoop and this goes down. So this line needs to be Does that make sense? If it doesn't, you'll figure it out. All right, now now we test. Keep your sight channel on at this point. Still important. All right, so we're about 1/4 of an inch, well, more like 1/8 at this point, between here and the edge of the paper. We have plenty of room to grab our grip. I have fortunately cut this so that if it is a decocker, I'm not going to have the decocker jamming into the edge of the mouth of the holster. Then on the back side, if they have a decocker, it can be molded in to this area, but I'm going to fold this leather to accept a safety. Your mag release is there so that you can pop out your mag if you want to, and material isn't going to be pushing on it when it's in your pants. All right. Yeah, this is going to be my template. I'm going to trace the top of this holster mouth, and then I'm going to use pressure important part. All right, now is the last point that you're going to screw this up. If you do screw it up, this is going to be the point where you screw it up. Trace these holes, and when I trace them and I put them back on, I put them on so that they're low. I don't want to cut too high because I don't want to put a stitch line right here and go into the edge of a T-nut. I don't know if you've ever seen a needle break on a machine, but they more like explode. And yeah, they'll go through an eye. Pencil for this part. Something to consider with a body shield. You want your body shield to be wider than the trigger guard, because when you're holstering, eventually this body shield is going to weaken, and the narrower it is, the faster it's going to weaken. And if I have this body shield this small, this area right here can get pushed into the trigger area and hit that. So I make the widest or the narrowest point of this trigger guard wider, or this body shield wider than the trigger guard. All right, I have a template. Match these guys up to make sure that you don't have any discrepancies. Test if you want to one more time to make sure that you don't have problems. And if you have access to a bright light, line this up, get it where it is set properly, and you can use this bright light to make sure that you don't have problems in your design with regard to your stitch line versus your the profile of your gun. This is what I expect this holster to look like at the end of the day. There's that, and then this guy's gonna go right about there. Let's see how it works out. Caleb with Bitterroot Gunleather. That is how I design a holster template. And afterwards, I'll just say now, the most important part of this, throw this away. Throw this away and never use it again, because this is a standard that you should have as an artisan. You should be done with this holster, and if you're satisfied with your work, you should be able to point out a flaw, something that you did wrong, so that next time you'll consider, and you will have to train yourself to remember those considerations in your designs for next time. This is my first time doing this holster for this gun. I'm sure that I'm gonna screw it up. If I do, it's probably gonna be right about here, and I will have to remember to make my change right there next time I do it. But that's how you get better. You make mistakes. Caleb from Bitterroot Gunleather, have a great day.